Gavel in the Public Safety Committee meeting. We're here Wednesday, February 28th. It's just after 1. I guess we can start with the front table, Mr. Gates.
Dean Gates, Assembly Council. Forrest Dunbar.
John Middleton.
Susanna Graham.
Steve Training.
Eric Croft.
Pete Peterson.
Fred Dyson.
Justin Dahl, APD.
And we can go ahead and the audience can
MJ Tim.
Nora Worthington. Linda Chase, Rogers Park Community Council, Fire Safety.
Ken McCoy, APD.
Melinda Freeman, the Director of the Department of Health and Human Services.
Emily.
Eric Glad, ACLU of Alaska.
Sean Case, Anchorage Police.
Nicholas Danger.
Krista Smith, Communications Director.
And have we started the recording? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and Amy, are you there?
I am online, and I believe there's another member online as well.
Yeah, I'm here. Christopher Congress.
Good, Amy and Chris, thanks. We'll try and speak up for you. Let us know if you have trouble hearing. We have 2 items on the agenda today. Mostly a presentation by Chief Dahl on some of the reorganization and allocation of new officers. All of us know, I think most of the public knows, we've been trying to take what money we can from other departments and put it into the police force, regrow the department back to appropriate numbers. That takes time both to recruit and then to train, and so those are just coming online. Some are actually on their own, some are coming out of the training process. So we're going to hear a report on that, what Chief Dahl, what his numbers are and what he's doing with those. And then if we had time, I had on the agenda a report on a cooperative arrangement between the municipal prosecutors and the homeless coordinator about what we do with some of our low-level trespass people. I know Seneca, I talked to her earlier this week. She's in trial, I believe, and Nancy may have had a conflict. If we have time, I may either put that off to the next meeting, if we don't, or describe it. But the main order of business is to hear about what we're doing with the new officers that we've recruited and hired. And I passed out, I'll turn it over to Chief Dahl, but I did pass out the APD codes. I've learned from the ride-along that these vary from department to department, which seems crazy to me, but these are the ones. So where possible, people can speak in the 10 codes, or I guess the 11 codes. I'm not sure why you need to, but hopefully you won't. But we are ready to talk.
Thank you, sir. You should have a handout from us that's just kind of some basic slides. I've been told that they're a little bleak looking because they're very plain, but I will say that the outlook for the police department is definitely not bleak. It's very, very good for this year. So if you look at the first slide, it talks about sworn personnel allocation, and in red down at the bottom, it talks about July of 2015, we had about 354 sworn personnel. And today, February 2018, we have about 435 sworn. And we're actually authorized to be right around 450 in this year's budget. So we're planning on running an academy in June, and hopefully between that academy and not having too much attrition, we hope to land right around that 450 number and then try to hold there throughout the rest of the year, having an academy again in December as needed to make up for attrition. You can see that compared to this time last year, various sections of the department have grown quite a bit. Patrol has grown from 159 to 178. Detectives have grown by a few positions, crime suppression. And you can see that that training number is the number of people that are still in training, which includes the academy and field training. So like today we have 53, that includes the 36 at the academy right now, and then the remainder are in field training working their way through. So because we've been going through this big hiring cycle, and this is something you've heard me say over and over again, there's typically a fairly good chunk of the department that's still in training, kind of working their way through that pipeline. But the good news is that we've been catching up, and so more and more of the total number of sworn are actually people out on the street doing police work, and we're sort of closing that gap. So We intend to continue to do that throughout 2018. And if I could kind of just give like a high-level overview of what we've done so far and what the plans are, it is continue to grow patrol and kind of fill out some of the other parts of the police department that got cut back over in the years prior to 2015. So, for example, we've already grown patrol a fair amount. I would like to continue to do that. The primary reason is that, as you all know, patrol is the reactive first, tip of the spear at the police department. And so, when people call the police and ask for help, patrol obviously are the ones who respond first. The police department responds to every single call for service. We're going to continue to respond to every single call for service because that's the core function of the police department. But we want to be able to build on that and not have that be the only thing that patrol is capable of doing. And frankly, for the last however many years, they have just been barely keeping up with that. But we're getting to a point where we're starting to see an ability to do things besides just that bare minimum of respond to calls for service. Things like, spinning some people off into crime suppression, the investigative support unit, doing things like the retail theft detail that we've had some press about recently. We've added some staff to various parts of detectives, the violent crime section, the property crime section. We want to continue doing that. We want to kind of fill out some of those areas. We want patrol to also have that ability to do things like foot patrol downtown or add a fourth car to Eagle River, which is something that we're about to do here in the very near future. Obviously last night we took on sewer highway enforcement, so we're going to begin doing that. So those are all things that we have the ability to do because we have been growing the police department. But at the end of all that, we also want patrol officers to actually have that time to get out of their car once in a while and just talk to residents or businesses in their patrol beats. We're in the process of realigning those beat boundaries, kind of that little geographic slice of acreage that patrol cars get assigned to, so they match up directly with community council districts. There are a whole bunch of reasons that we're doing that. One of them is that obviously that provides a better model when you start talking about that neighborhood policing or whatever label you want to put on it, because community councils are kind of that lowest level of sort of quasi-government organization that neighborhoods have, and sort of like that first interaction point for residents. So we think that's really good. Plus, when we start looking at things that are happening in neighborhoods, we want to a lot of times pull that information out by community council district. So having that marry up with the beats internally for us makes it easier for us to kind of manage the information by neighborhood. But fundamentally, I want folks to have kind of semi-permanent assignments to those beat boundaries and get to know the people that live there or work there, depending on what part of town it is. Look at my notes here. We talked about, we have 53 in training and 36 in the academy. That's the largest academy we've ever run. I think that the June and December academies this year won't be quite that big, but mostly try to just kind of keep our staffing even around that 450 mark.
This adds to about 300, so there's about 100 more in various smaller subdivisions, or?
Yeah, so if you look at detectives and crime suppression, I'm not sure that this number accounts for every single person in there, but crime suppression is composed of like the traffic unit, the DUI unit, school resource officers, things like that. And for the traffic unit's a good example of one of the places that was cut back pretty significantly. I think about 2012. I was actually the traffic sergeant at the time, and we cut the staffing in the traffic unit by about 50%. So it used to be about 14 or 15 officers, and I think we're down to 6 right now.
Traffic versus patrol, what?
So that's a good question. Traffic is specifically, those officers typically are not responding to calls for service. They are dedicated to just doing traffic enforcement around town and responding to collisions and stuff like that. So patrol will do traffic enforcement as one of their functions, but it tends to fall behind a lot of the other things that we also expect patrol officers to do, right? Everything from responding to medical emergencies to getting out of their cars and talking to people to, responding to homicides or whatever else happens to be going on. So by having people dedicated to traffic enforcement, we make sure that that mission's not slipping through the cracks someplace.
And Mr. Trainee and then Mr. Dunmore. Mr. Trainee?
Since you're getting to 450 officers, I see that crime suppression at 59. Are some of those 59 going to be dedicated to gangs?
We already have, part of that number that's in there are 3 officers that are currently dedicated to that. Those 3 officers are assigned as task force officers to the FBI, and they work with a variety of federal, state, and local law enforcement and the Bureau together in one group on the Safe Streets Violent Crime and Gang Task Force. So we have people that are dedicated to that mission already every day. And what we get by participating, instead of doing it ourselves, what we get by participating in a task force like that is we get access to the kind of intelligence and resource that the FBI can bring to bear on that. And it's something that state troopers participate in. It's actually something that Homeland Security and a variety of other agencies all participate together in as a group. And we find that that's really, really effective because it allows us to not only share information, but also to kind of scale the investigation to the appropriate level depending on what they're looking at.
So make sure you've got people in there, because the last administration wiped the gang unit out. There's a lot of people in town that was a mistake, obviously. When you start dealing with traffic enforcement, can you deal with red light runners, please? I get calls all the time. Ever since I tried to have that red light product, they couldn't get the votes on this then, even though it's not becoming since I'm outside of the last time. But if you would work on red light runners, I get calls all the time from people. The light turns green, they count to 4, and then they try to proceed, because if they do it immediately, you're going to get nailed. We've got to start getting to red light enforcement. Thank you, Chief.
Amy and Chris, can you guys hear okay, or need people to speak up?
I can hear perfectly.
All right. We're 10-2, Forrest.
Yeah, I wanted to, Chief, if you could speak a little bit more about that community council idea. That's really interesting. And I really support that. I do think it's a good way to get down in the neighborhoods. On the other hand, there are some fairly obvious imperfections with that as a model. The first one is that they're not proportionate. So Pete and I have a community council in Northeast, and I think it's something like 1 in 20 of everyone in Anchorage lives in that community council. It's very large, it's very populous, and it's also very high crime. So how do you deal with the fact that they're not proportional?
No, it's a great question, and I'm actually glad you asked, because I don't think I explained it very well. But the beats are not for an individual car or officer. So, for example, the way that the patrol division's organized right now, and the way that they're assigned, like sort of downtown is kind of a beat, but sometimes there's 3 and 4 cars assigned to that one beat. So we would deal with beats that are drawn around community council boundaries in the same way, where because you're right, some of them are larger, and some of them aren't that big but have a really high population density, and some of them are just really big geographically. And so we would assign a number of cars to each beat, sort of depending on what that was. So if you had that higher density with a lot of residents, like the one that you pointed out, it would not just have a single patrol car on a shift assigned to it. It'd probably have 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. Depending on the time of day, what kind of activity level we're seeing there, what kind of projects are going on, those kinds of things. But it wouldn't be diluted down to just one.
Right. I guess the other thing that's a quick follow-up to that too, I guess it's a little bit of a comment as well. I mean, if part of the thinking of that is so you can also interact and interface with the community council themselves, I think that's great. It's certainly good for our perspective because we interact with them as well. On the other hand, I don't want to get too far down that road because the community councils are not always representative of the community that they are supposed to. Like a good example is University Area Community Council, which great folks, but there's not a single college student that's even remotely involved. And so just that knowledge that community councils are not perfectly representative of those communities, I think is
sure. It too would be part of the outreach that officers were doing, as part of their just learning their beat, and because some of it too is depending on where your beat is, you might have a lot of businesses in that patrol beat, and you want to get to know those folks as well and what their concerns are and the issues that they're facing, stuff like that.
Mr. Falsey and Rada are 10-7. Mr. Steele.
Yeah, Chief. Just to comment on that last point about community councils and officer appreciate it. I'm not sure if I have to go every time. It's appropriate for them to see folks, and I think they appreciate it. The resource officers is my question. How many do we have? And a couple other things in terms of it's great to see the visibility of the vehicle out front of the schools. Are the officers inside? Do they go in armed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I know they go in because I've seen them. West I'm certainly familiar with. I know a couple of them, and it's great to have them in schools. And I just wonder from their perspective, is that a good assignment, or do they like it? Do they think they're doing good work? What's their feeling?
Yeah, so I think 15, is that the right number? Okay, so there are 15 school resource officers assigned right now. We're sort of kicking around. There's some potential that maybe we could apply for some federal grants to maybe increase that number. But at least for the foreseeable future, we'll probably stay there, and then we can consider whether or not that's an area that needs to grow down the road. But to answer some of your other questions, so our officers are always armed. And if you see somebody in uniform without a gun, please let me know, because that would be a problem. So they do spend almost all of their day inside the school, and not just the high school, but all the feeder schools associated with that high school, and they do visits to other campuses as well. It's actually a sought-after position. The people that are currently assigned as school resource officers they love it. They're totally dedicated to it. They really, most of them have been doing it for years. They build a really strong connection to the school they're assigned to and the kids that are there. And it's amazing, not only from a security standpoint, but from an engagement standpoint. Once the students get to know their school resource officer, the amount and type of information that they're willing to relay is tremendous.
I have heard nothing but good from students as well as administrators in schools. Their interaction with the kids is great, and the kids love them. They mess with them a lot, so you got to have somebody with a sense of humor. But I think they're a great asset. It's certainly a better way of dealing with security than what they're talking about before at the moment. But I really appreciate it. So I'm glad we're supporting it.
Thank you.
Mr. Peterson, Mr. Training on that point?
Yes. Chief, do they work 4 days or 5 days a week in SRO?
I think right.
Section 5 days a week.
It is. Typically, there are a couple of them assigned to each high school, and so one of them works on, they work 410s like a lot of other sections of the police department do. And so they'll have one that works on Monday and one that works on Friday, and the other 3 days they overlap.
Because I was asked by a school board member, you could talk to unions, see if they could work a deal out so they'd work 8-hour shifts 5 days a week. If you at least take a look at that, they would like an officer there all the time.
I think we're mostly achieving that now, but it's something I can talk to EPDD about.
You would please, because I know it's a union issue, but I told the school board I'd bring it up to you.
I will bring it up with them.
Thank you.
And then what do they do in the summer?
That's a great question. So there are some school sessions in the summertime. Some people tend to go to summer school, and so they will participate in that to a certain extent. But the bulk of them end up getting reassigned to other things. In the past few years, what we've had them do is a very proactive bike patrol, around town, and a lot of that's. I'm sorry?
We were butting in.
The whole crew here was thinking the answer, and I said, he knows it, let him say it. Yeah.
So typically that's been in the core downtown district for the last few years, but last summer, with our ability to bring back on foot patrol downtown, they were really able to spread out and spend a lot of time in parks and trails around town, all over town, not just downtown. And we got a lot of feedback from the community that was very well received. And in addition, what we heard from downtown businesses and people, employees and stuff was that the foot patrols were really more effective downtown because the bikes tend to move quickly enough that they don't always have the same level of engagement with sort of the ongoing issues downtown. And that foot patrol was really actually more effective in the core downtown district. So that worked out very, very well on both accounts. So, and sometimes depending on what else is happening, we may have other sort of special assignments that they end up doing, but it ends up working out really well to have them sort of freed up over the summer.
Mr. Weddleton?
So, to the average person on the street, how come I don't see patrols in my neighborhood? I get that all the time. They never come to my neighborhood. So, what's your allocation of patrols, and then how many officers are patrolling at any time?
Good question. So to the first one, I think that we're there more frequently than people tend to see sometimes. But what I'm starting to hear is that more and more people are like, I feel like I'm seeing more officers around town, and that should be the result of having, an additional 20 officers assigned to the patrol division between this year and last year. And as patrol continues to grow, that should continue to increase. And that's what we want. We want there to be a visible presence in neighborhoods of police officers. That's one of the things we hear the most. If I could just see more cars driving through the neighborhood and occasionally doing some traffic control and other stuff, people running the local stop sign or whatever. And that's the direction we're headed. That's why I want to continue to grow the patrol division. If you look at, we have 178 in patrol now, and with 53 in training, like the bulk of that 53 is going to go to the patrol division. That's going to feel like a lot more people out working the street. So that's going to continue to happen. The second part, or your second question, as to how many are working. It depends on the shift or the time of day. It depends on the day of the week. We tend to kind of know through our experience, but also reviewing a call for service data, what times are more busy. We try to staff appropriately. But for example, I stopped by the daily briefing for the swing shift late last week. And that's the shift that starts at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, runs until 1 in the morning. And a year or two ago, if you stop by that shift on a weeknight, and they had 23 people, 23 cars hitting the road, they were like, okay, well, yeah, we think we can hold it down with 23. It's not great, but we can get it done. And that wasn't uncommon. And they had 32 the other night. So that's a pretty substantial increase, and that feels very different. And I was a swing shift patrol guy for a long time, and I can tell you the difference that 8 or 10 extra cars on the road makes is massive when it comes to responding to calls for service. Not to mention doing all these extra things that I think we all want them to do, besides just running from one call to the next as quickly as they possibly can.
Is there a benchmark of what a city of our size should have? Are we going to plateau at 450, or is there a different target?
Well, Mr. Chair, I think, did I miss Mr. Peterson's question? Or?
Oh, you're right. Did I apologize, Pete? Let's do that.
I actually was going to ask the same question to John. How many are on patrolling at a given time? And it used to be 22, 23 was the common answer. And if we're up into 30, that's a really good sign, I think. It's definitely trending the right way. So.
I would agree. It's much better. Thank you. Mr. Croft, is your question about kind of what's the standard size? It's a really difficult question to answer because, of course, each community is a little different. And as we all know, Anchorage is always different than every place else. And some of the things that might apply to one city in Southern California versus another city in Southern California might not apply to Anchorage. And when you take into account that, well, up until last night, the police service area was about 195 square miles, and now it's somewhat bigger. But the municipality in total is 2,000 square miles, right? So we have a huge footprint. I think it's, again, Anchorage is different than every place else. And so it's sort of a long way of saying, I'm not sure what an ideal number might be for Anchorage. We're going to be around 450 in 2018, I kind of think, for the bulk of the year. That's larger than APD's ever been. And we've been, working really hard for a few years to grow. So I don't think that this is a terrible time to kind of, let training catch up a little bit. sort of feel operationally, what does it feel like to be 450 officers? And how does the community feel about that? Do they feel like they're getting the service level that they want? Do we feel like there are more things that we want the police department to do? And then decide if we should continue to grow or we think this is right. You know, and I think that it's very community specific what the answer to that question is. And I think that we should, you know, frankly, be engaging, you know, Anchorage residents when we're talking about that. You know, is the police department doing what you want us to do?
Mr. Dunbar?
I'm fine.
So what, yeah, Mr. Chairman.
There was a study done a few years ago, Chief. I forget what the study was called. PERF. We would use that as a standard to determine how many officers we had. Have we met that yet?
We're very close. So PERF was done the first time in 2010, and PERF is an organization that the MOA hired to sort of review the police department and make recommendations. And if my recollection of the 2010 report is correct, there was actually a recommendation then that the police department should grow in size. However, if you had to make some cuts, here were some places that maybe you could make cuts. And I think that was mostly what was focused on in that report. It was done again in 2016, and again suggested that the police department should grow and gave some recommendations on how that should happen, and also on some recruiting and things. And I think that what they said was that if you wanted to start seeing some unobligated time out of your police department, I think the number they gave us was 448. So we're very, very close to achieving that. And you know, my target is around 450. I think if my reading of our budget document is correct, we're actually authorized a few more than that, but having a target of about 450 is good because that gives us the flexibility to maybe be a little bit bigger when the academy starts, and then of course that training pipeline is so long, having more really than we intend to have allows for that attrition that's going to occur naturally during the training cycle to happen and not get us to fall too far below that target number. I really want to avoid this big up and down swing in our staffing level. It's disruptive to the organization, and it's just disruptive to the level of service that we can provide. So I'm really trying to even that out.
Chief, are we going to have another study done? This is 2018. You said the last one was 16. Are we looking at one in 18 too? Now that we've reached here, what should we be doing with the manpower we have?
I think that we have a really good template with what we have. We could contemplate if we decide that the department should grow again, doing something like that, but I don't think that there are any plans immediately to commission another study, and they're somewhat expensive.
I know. I remember. Thank you.
Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several questions, and you can give me short answers.
Okay.
I notice on your codes here, there's nothing for active shooter or hostage situation. Onto the left, yeah.
You're correct.
Okay. Don't need it.
Not really. That's something that will be very clearly communicated, and it will result in another code being given that will pull everybody out of the woodwork.
Yeah. So, how many people you got working on child sexual issues? I think of the online porn, and also the assaults against children.
Good question. So that's two separate detective units, and I believe that combined it's 12 detectives and 2 sergeants. Yep.
And
DC McCoy's telling me I'm right. So.
Yeah. All right. Several years ago, we evolved these child advocacy centers to do both the interviews of the kids and keep them traumatizing. Is that still working?
I think it works very well. In fact, if you want detail on that,
I don't.
Deputy Chief McCoy is an expert.
Okay.
But we think it's a good model, and we think that it's a national best practice the way Anchorage is set up.
Worked hard on that one. Back in the day, and it's been a few years ago when I talked to one of your gang guys, he said our gangs here were a bit unique in that they weren't centered around a piece of turf or a piece of business, and that their shooting at one another was largely over somebody dissing somebody else or putting the moves on their girlfriend or something.
That remains very accurate, and they typically don't show the ethnic cohesion that other locations tend to have, and they're very fluid, where membership changes back and forth more often than you might think.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time in our prisons here, and there's very significant gangs. Yeah, and those are mostly ethnic. This new gang that's showing up national with MS-13 or some darn thing. Somebody remember? You don't know, so they must not be showing up here. I suggested, and you and Ethan were way ahead of me as usual, that we try to get cops down with Brother Francis for people with outstanding warrants, possession, and all those things. And I understand you guys have been pretty active. Give me a few words about that.
We have been there almost every day for the last couple of months, partnering with the agencies that are down there and other agencies in the city, but we have had a very strong and consistent presence on those campuses for quite a while.
And are you able to pick up warrants of people, parole violations, and all that? Are you hauling some people off?
They're doing that, and my understanding is that it is actually reducing sort of the peripheral effects of.
That's what I expected.
Yeah, having like a lot of the problems we were seeing 6 months ago, sort of the end of the summer. My understanding is that that's cleaned up quite a bit.
Yeah. All right. And back in the day, you used to get quite a few cops that came here that were coming from some other jurisdiction where they had been police officers. Is that still true?
Oh, in our recruiting?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. That is correct. We do still attract people from outside and from other agencies. And I will expand a little bit on recruiting and retention if anybody's interested. But okay, so in 2018, there are, I think, just a little over 100. Is that number right? Officers at APD that could be eligible to retire, which sometimes keeps me up at night. And so we are working very hard on our retention and of course also on our recruiting. And that's something that's a little bit more predictable, and it's hard to get like actual data on that, but the anecdotal information that I have is that many people that had considered that they would do 20 years here and be gone are now talking about sticking around for substantially longer, maybe moving up in the organization, and I think that's a very good sign of sort of organizational health. The thing that does concern me, though, is that we have lost far more people in the kind of 4 to 7 year range than we have in the past. And of course, one of the reasons is that the money they put into the Tier 4 PERS system is very portable to them, and they can take that with them and go to the private sector or go to another agency out of state or whatever. I know there are efforts underway to remedy that, but that's something that I'm concerned about. And then part of it too is just a generational difference where when I got hired, you sort of expected to stay there for a career and not go anywhere else. And people that are fairly young being hired today have an expectation that they're going to have sort of multiple employers and careers in their life. And so what our response to that needs to be is making sure that we give them good career tracks so they can see themselves at the organization for a long time. They can see how to advance and progress their career. So that's something we're constantly working on improving internally. So that's anyway, you made me think of that other stuff. Thank you.
Glad to make you think. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chief.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Trainee is 1093 for about 15 minutes. We'll be back. The general increase in patrol makes a lot of sense. The general increase in those categories. Are there specific, very targeted efforts you're able to do now that sort of some of the pressure is off patrol? Maybe you can tell us something about those.
And I assume you mean targeted enforcement?
Yeah, we read in the paper, right? You're inside and planning it, but on vehicle thefts, on shopliftings, on some of the cooperations with the feds.
We have been able to do that, and thank you for asking that. So there has been some press, but we've been able to take some members of the Crime Suppression Division that consist of like the Investigative Support Unit, the Community Policing Team, and sometimes some others, and partner, for example, with local business. So we've done it with Walmart, we've done it with Fred Meyer. We're going to continue to do it, but really have an intense, targeted focus on retail theft. And I think that the last time they did it in 6 hours, they made 17 arrests. They recovered a stolen vehicle. They identified people with warrants. I mean, all the things that you would sort of expect with really targeting, in a location-specific way, something that we have been, hearing over and over again is an ongoing issue. So that we feel is very successful. We want to continue to do those types of targeted enforcement events because they're very effective. Same thing with stolen vehicles. We want to be able to focus on that, but recently we were able to leverage the partnerships that we've been working on for the last 6 or 8 months with a lot of our other law enforcement partners that exist in Anchorage to get a handle on stolen vehicles. Stolen vehicles obviously have been way up the last couple of years. We want to have an impact on that. So recently, we really made sure that internally our property crimes section inside the detective division had the ability to focus on people that we knew were consistently involved in stolen vehicles, and then take that and partner with federal agencies on appropriate crimes that had a federal nexus, and then take that to the U.S. Attorney and do some federal prosecution on it for a couple of reasons. One is that we're really using a better tool to sort of encapsulate all of the stuff that they're doing as a result of their stolen vehicle activities, like having guns and drugs and all these other things. But also, they tend to get, frankly, longer sentences in the federal system. And because of that, there tends to be a chilling effect on people's interest in being involved in that criminal activity. We're starting to hear sort of anecdotally from patrol already that the word is out and that the feds are prosecuting people for stolen vehicles. And
you don't have to put them all away, you just have to put enough that the word gets out?
That is sometimes helpful. And so we're seeing a little bit of change in behavior with regards to people being willing to arm themselves during some of these crimes and other things. And again, it's sometimes these things are hard to pin down with real information. It's just, this is sort of the feedback I'm getting from patrol officers who are out actually working these cases. But that does have a detrimental effect, knowing that there's going to be a significant consequence for being involved in that. It can sometimes change people's behavior. So,
and it still doesn't seem, Chief, to be a chop shop operation like that is in some other cities in the lower 48. It's a drive around and commit other crimes or drive around for fun?
Correct. And I mean, when we're recovering 93–94% of the stolen vehicles within a week or a week and a half, I mean, that's all, a lot of them, obviously. And so I think if you just look at that number, you can kind of infer that they're not being broken up and sold or transported out of state intact and sold, which obviously is difficult to do. It is, they're being traded around as sort of almost a street currency, plus also being used to commit other crimes, whether it be burglary or retail theft or whatever else it is. They're using the stolen vehicles to do that.
And then this increase, you're saying sworn over and over. What increases, if any, have we done on non-sworn? What is the impact as we increase one part of the police department?
Well, that's a good question. Thank you for asking that, because I have the slide in front of me but had forgotten to look at it. So we actually have not increased the non-sworn staff that much. And if you're not familiar with what that is, that's the people that work at APD that are not badge-carrying, gun-toting police officers. So it's the communication center staff that answer 911 and dispatch police officers. It's the record staff that manages all of the police reports and other paperwork that all these officers are generating. The property and evidence staff that handles and collects and inventories all of the evidence and other property that the police department seizes. It's all of those things. The crime lab. Those things are critical to the function of the police department, and we have really not grown those at all. And so
they seem to have shrunk. So they sort of shrunk with the shrinking number of sworn from 7 to 8 to 18, and then didn't bounce back when we bounced.
Correct. So if you look at that slide, you can see, for example, dispatch is down by 8 positions, yet calls for service have increased pretty significantly in that time period. And as a result, what happens are two things really. We're, especially if you look at someplace like dispatch. I mean, dispatch, that's all 911 calls in the Anchorage Bulk go to the police dispatch center first and then get farmed out from there. So that's all the people answering 911. Well, we have to have a certain number of people there to handle that job, and we're not going to go below that. So what it means is we're going to end up putting people there on overtime, which is much more expensive than having somebody there as just their normal course of duty, and that becomes expensive. Plus, because we're trying to balance that against not spending too much, you know, we end up having concerns about whether or not we're providing an appropriate level of service there. So if you've called the police department and had to wait for a while to get through to speak to somebody, you know, you kind of understand what I'm talking about. So, I mean, that's honestly the thing that we need to look at next when we talk about whether or not how we're going to grow the police department is adding staff to those sections. And it's, you know, some of them are really sort of critical at this point.
So it's, from your perspective, not so much taking the sworn from 450 to 500 as it is taking the non-sworn up to some appropriate level.
If I had to pick between the two at this point, it would be adding non-sworn staff, to be honest.
Mr. Dyson.
Kind of covered this, but I think, is it safe to assume that most of the low-level property crimes are drug-related? Secondly, would you comment on what's going on with white-collar crimes, swindling, con games? And lastly, are there any, used to be quite a few high-stakes illegal poker games going on in town? My guess is that's gone away, but anyways, what do you know?
Well, with property crime, I will tell you that in my experience, and it sometimes can be difficult to link directly, like on a kind of one-for-one basis with data, but my experience is that a lot of property crime involves some element of illegal drug use.
Alcohol or drug, or you're specifically saying?
I think that sometimes alcohol, but I honestly think that it tends to be more drug related. You know, people, it's difficult to maintain a steady income if you have an illegal drug habit or even a prescription drug habit, and as a result, trying to, you know, supply that drug habit. Yes. Short answer is yes. I think so.
He really likes short answers, but you can do whatever you want. You're the chief. But.
And the white collar
it's debatable.
Con games and stuff.
I honestly have no idea.
Yeah, there's quite a few going on. I'm not sure what in the jurisdiction of the troopers or feds, but
I mean, I can tell you that we work closely with both of those entities in our financial crime section, and we have people that could probably talk to you about it all day long. I just don't have that now.
Yeah, and don't go out of your way, but I would enjoy knowing and suspect my colleagues would. Please.
Okay.
Is there a third that we missed?
I think it was gambling.
Well,
but
the gambling.
Oh, okay, that's it.
Same answer.
Okay.
All right.
Some highly placed elected officials, all of whom were friends, got swept up in a few of those in years past.
We need names, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Steele.
Yeah, and just a comment on those traveling poker games and stuff. We had a house in our neighborhood that was vacant, and the owner was out of state. They rented it, and they had tons of cars every weekend there for poker games, and it took a little while to get them out. Ultimately, people knew the owner, and the neighborhood knew the owner, and called them out of state and said, "Hey, your house is being used like this." And finally, they got them out, and they just moved somewhere else.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And but it was distressing, I guess, in the neighborhood in terms of having that building.
Ms. Morris, is it true you're leaving for other jobs?
That is true, yes.
Without telling me the street name, what's your street number?
1138.
Yeah.
11? Oh, 1138.
It's not lost on people.
All right. Okay. Any other questions from the committee? So just a few will wrap up. I saw that Seneca and Nancy are here or were. So do you believe that the expansion of service to cover the Seward Highway you can do without stretching your manpower too thin because of these patrol increases?
I think so. In fact, something we sort of talked about very briefly last night is that as a result of having the grant from the state legislature to provide some highway patrol in that area, we have been doing that pretty regularly in the patrol division already, and that was coming from the shifts every day. That wasn't, you know, sometimes we get special enforcement money to do seatbelt enforcement or holiday enforcement, and those officers end up being on overtime, so that's in addition to the patrol division, right? It's people on their days off coming in to do that. What we've been doing with the grant that we received from the state was just having patrol send people down there as part of the course of their normal work day. So we've already had that presence there fairly consistently as a result of that. So adding this as a permanent thing is not going to be a massive stretch for the patrol division to be able to accomplish, because we've mostly already been doing it.
And then adding the 4th officer to Eagle River, is that a planned thing or a done thing?
It's basically a done thing.
Amy or Chris, any questions?
I don't have any questions, but I do want to say thank you. This morning out at the Chugach Eagle River Senior Center, we had an overwhelming show of police officers, and I have to tell you, I felt incredibly safe. They'll laugh because I think there was about 20 of them out there, but I think adding that 4th officer is key, especially with just the amount Chugach Eagle River has grown over the years, and APD's response policies and stuff. I think it just makes sense. So I appreciate Chief Dahl, you bringing that forward and getting that done.
Thank you.
And Eric, this is Christopher. I don't want to ruin a perfect record of not speaking in a meeting, so I'll just say thank you.
There you go. Yeah.
I think there's a question.
Did you have a question? Oh, yeah, sure.
I just wanted to know if there's anything that can be done about panhandling, because what we see in Midtown, Rogers Park area, is groups start parking on these corners, and it becomes a mess, and people don't want to walk by there.
It can be very challenging for a law enforcement agency in the United States, not just in Anchorage, but anywhere, to address somebody who is standing in a public area with a sign that says something. They have we all have a lot of constitutional rights that protect that activity. And so directly addressing panhandling in that way can be a challenge. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that we all have those constitutionally protected rights. Probably the best way to address panhandling is to encourage people not to hand out money, because people panhandle because it works. And that's something that last fall I was at a big conference for police chiefs, and that was a topic of discussion. A lot of cities struggle with that, and typically cities that have had success addressing it, they have good campaigns that redirect the public. If you want to donate money, here are some good places to do that where you can actually help somebody who needs help. But handing cash out through your window when you're stopped in traffic doesn't help anybody. And so that's probably the best way to address that. It's not likely that's something that we can enforce our way out of with the police department.
Well, Chief, thank you. We'll have you back, of course. I think we're working on some of the results of this. That is, some data to come back on what this increased manpower has achieved in terms of arrests and other data. So we'll have you back for that. Thank you for all your good work. And then, if I can bring up Ms. Nino and Ms. Burr. This is not the biggest thing ever, but I sat on a meeting that these two and their staff had, and to me it just exemplified what you can do if you have good people, but also good communication on it. So I want to just brag on them briefly, and then we'll go. You can answer any questions. They can answer any questions. It concerned trespass, which is kind of one of our lower crimes, right? It's people in a place they're not supposed to be. And it was two different sides of the trespass problem. The prosecutors originally called the meeting with Ms. Burke because there were criminal prosecutions of people who were just going into Walnut, going into the Claudius, going into whatever, weren't particularly doing any criminal activity, but weren't wanted there and wouldn't leave. And the prosecutor's office was looking for other options besides jail and threats of jail or deferred sentences or jail itself, and wanted some help from Ms. Burke on putting those people ahead in line for homeless services. And the flip side, and that was productive discussion. They're starting to do that. The flip side discussion was Ms. Burke saying, we're trying to clean up, and I'm summarizing, they can correct me, but we're trying to clean up the Beans and Brother Francis Shelter campus. And we sometimes trespass the most destructive or dangerous people there for violations, drug, alcohol, weapon behavior. And your office sometimes declines those, I think not knowing that they're a priority for us. And so we'll trade you, yeah, it wasn't this crude, but it could be, we'll trade you 10 people who are going to jail who shouldn't be for 10 people who weren't going to jail that should be. And it's just in its infancy, but I think those kind of small to medium level cooperations can do a lot, have already done a lot on helping with the campus. And the other end is harder to measure, but not putting people in jail who just were going in to warm up and finding some other option. Just Jill wanted to thank you, but did I materially misstate stuff, and how do we know how things are going?
No, I think that about sums it up pretty clearly. The one thing I would add is that we have the opportunity both to observe our defendants who may be in need of these kinds of services based on the types of crimes they're committing or the reason they're committing those crimes repeatedly. We also have the opportunity to identify victims of crime who are in high need of services or assistance as well. And so that's the other part of it, is that we may be able to refer both defendants, ironically, both defendants and victims for priority services. And so I think that's a partnership to me that feels a lot like Deputy Chief Case's diversion program. And again, looking at how you are finding your people and trying to find an alternative outcome for them than what is the norm.
Nancy, how do you step up those people in line or whatever? How does that work?
To be determined. There is the community coordinated entry list, which has a prioritization that's determined by fund source primarily. But if we're talking about community resources, and there are some openings for community resources, we can make another set of priorities for people who are referred to those unrestricted resources. So for instance, the Providence just recently approved another round of funding for this whole system build out, and there's a small part of it, about 150 or 200,000, that's for adults who need rapid rehousing resources. And so I think as we set up that criteria,
that could be targeted that way.
Would be a really good place for it.
And how is the sort of cleanup or more strict enforcement Rules, or however you describe what we're doing at Beans and Brother Francis? Can you give us a status update on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's we just looked at the numbers again last week. We see reductions of about 30% of calls from both fire and police, and that's because of the CAP team and because of the cooperation with the fire department, with an EMT.
Tell us the elements again, or just
sure.
Remind me.
What's new about the work we're doing is the lead person on this project is a mental health professional who's assisting other nonprofits and municipal agencies in identifying people who need assessment, making a more technical assessment of needs, and a better referral process. And so as we look at a campus approach, we're looking at the needs of all of the people in that one area. But then once this stabilizes and we're able to assess and triage people appropriately, that team will begin going down to the person level, which is what our conversation was about. How do you defer people who are repeatedly going through these systems what are the intervention points that we can identify? And so the prosecutor's office is one. We've also been in contact with Providence, the psychiatric emergency department. We will make contact with the psychiatric hospital and other points around the system where people sort of tend to flail, and find those intervention points and where we can help get that person to the right resource at the right time. So the reduction in calls tells us that the triage and assessment is going, we think, well. The interesting part about it is that the reductions in the procedures we're changing, and the reductions tend to hold mostly when the team is not on campus. So we're making permanent changes to how services are delivered downtown, things like how long people have to wait to get into the shelter. Before we started, people were waiting a couple of hours.
And then they get frustrated or cold or...
And they start fighting, yeah, they start fighting. And so now we've been able to align that so people are waiting a much less time. I've been asking people to use the degree outside as your guideline of how long people should wait. If it's 0, it should be 0. And so that it's harder than that simplification. But those kinds of things are what we're changing, and how things are looking better down there.
So the effects seem to be holding even when the officers aren't right there visibly on duty.
Yes, because there's a connected access to the team, and if there's a problem, the point person, which is Melina Breland, who spoke at the last homeless committee meeting, we'd be happy to have her talk with you here. She's the point, and so then she knows, okay, what's happening, and can help better triage than just picking up the phone and calling 911.
And Seneca, you may not have it at the tip, but the chief was talking about the increase in sworn creating a demand for increase in unsworn. Are we seeing an uptick in prosecutions, that is stuff coming in your door, or is it too early to tell from the door?
I haven't run the numbers from 2017 yet, but my suspicion based on what the caseload looks like is that it's on the upswing again.
So in a number of different areas, as we bring up the sworn, unsworn, maybe prosecution, we're going to have these other things that go up. Patrol officers in particular, just more of them driving around, catch more drug drivers. We expect you to do it on the same amount of money.
I don't know.
Or less would be good. Any other questions? Yeah, Mr. President.
Yeah, you probably covered this. You do an amazing job. What I want to know is the problems we have with you not having enough staff. Problem getting people to trial and stuff.
Right now, we're doing fine.
May your tribe increase. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Pierce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you get to a point where you're getting more cases than you can handle, you should be sure to communicate that with us so that we can take a look at possibly adding another prosecutor if we can find some funding somewhere.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Just no new money. You can add positions.
Just to
volunteer
illustrate
prosecutors.
that.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
When the SB 91 came, one of the things that got overlooked is we were wanting to get people shoplifting and smash and grab folks. Second offense, lock them up or take them away and lock them up. But it said conviction. So we have at least one guy that had 11 or 13 arrests in 1 year, and the first one hadn't got to court yet. That's the kind of thing that you got to be a lot smarter than me to have thought of ahead of time. But that's the kind of backup or backlog that we can't handle. It just practically messes all stuff up. Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, but thank you both, and we're adjourned.